What you are looking at is one of the greatest seasons any driver has ever put together in my lifetime. These numbers are championship caliber in any era of NASCAR. An absurd average starting position of 5.4 and an average finish of 6.6. And to think, this guy did this with just 3 poles and 3 wins. That means he was ridiculously consistent, week in and week out for 29 straight weeks of competition. This guy must have won the championship easily, right? This just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. No, really, it doesn't add up. The points literally don't add up. We're 46 points short. What the hell happened? This is going to be part 1 of an ongoing series that I'm going to call the Mark Martin Apologetics Tour, where I go over all 5 of Mark Martin's championship runner-up seasons. I don't know when the successive parts are going to come out. I don't really have a timetable in mind because this series exists solely for my own benefit, and you're just along for the ride, so welcome aboard. The point of this series isn't to poke fun at anybody or open up old wounds. It is merely a series meant to show the average NASCAR fan or passerby what it was like being a fan of the man that most people know as the greatest driver to never wear the crown. And whether you agree with that distinction or not, by the time this series wraps up, even if Mark Martin isn't your favorite race car driver of all time, I hope you will agree with me that he is NASCAR's greatest protagonist. No man was so beloved by so many people, fans and drivers alike. So, let's get into it. The fact that we're discussing Mark Martin making a championship run in NASCAR's top division in 1990 is honestly a miracle. No one, not even Mark himself, thought he'd ever get here just a few years ago. Because in 1983, by all accounts, his career was dead at the scene. Coming from the late model short track scene of Arkansas, Mark had garnered a reputation by age 15 for overperforming and defeating local legends left and right in his red and white number 2. Why the number 2? Well, he thought number 1 was just a bit too cocky and brash, so he opted for a less assuming number. In 1981, he entered a few races at the short tracks on the Cup schedule, and had instant success, nabbing 2 poles and a top 5 for his efforts. He skipped the lower divisions for the most part, and has come fresh out of the American Speed Association, a Midwestern-based late-model touring series. He is just astounded at his early success as everybody else. He had been told that this was going to be a different beast than what he was used to, but it seems like a breeze so far. He's an owner driver and is extremely hands-on and innovative when it comes to setting up his race cars. So innovative, in fact, that he became semi-famous in mechanic circles for running a car with no right rear spring at Winchester and shattering the track record. When he qualified 5th for his first race ever in the Cup Series, legendary crew chief Jake Elder asked the new kid who he had never seen before about his setup. He's perplexed as to why Mark Martin only has 2 gauges in his car, and then follows up with the question, "Hey, how much lead you got in this thing?" Typically, most cars run about 150 pounds of left side ballast to help the cars turn better. But Mark, who ran absurd outside-the-box setups, just shrugs and says, "I don't know, about 400 pounds I think?" Jake Elder just laughs and walks away. Later at his shop, Mark's tearing down his car getting it ready for the next race, and discovers he wasn't running 400 pounds of ballast, it was 600 pounds. Mark's got a lot on his plate as he sets out to go full-time in 1982, but he's taking advantage of a model change from the 1981 season. The wheelbases and tread widths were shortened, and the cars were more compact and harder to drive. And nobody has these things fully figured out yet. He also has a sponsorship lined up with Apache Stove, who promises $50,000 throughout the year. But as the first few races come and go, Apache Stove goes bankrupt, and Mark never got a dime. By the end of the year, Mark is broke, and a late season collapse means that he didn't even win the Rookie of the Year title. He sells off everything he has left in 1983 to settle his debts, and takes a ride with JD Stacy, who is gaining a reputation as a huckster and an unscrupulous car owner. JD eventually ousts Mark for poor performance, but his numbers were fairly solid and his DNFs were usually caused by equipment failures. Mark floundered around driving for a few different teams, but by the end of the season he's fed up and quits his dreams of being a NASCAR star. Mark had sold everything to get his Cup program off the ground, and all of his ASA equipment was gone. He wants to drop back and race in the ASA series again. And during his heyday in that series, there was a program available where drivers with a lot of clout and talent could get free cars from constructors up front and work out payments through winnings and sponsors later. Mark calls up his old partner Ray Dillon in North Liberty, Indiana for a ride. Ray seems confused on the phone, and then eventually tells Mark the days of free cars are over. Mark Martin will have to completely restart his entire racing career from scratch. Mark had taken the chance moving up to the Cup Series on the assumption that he would always be able to go back, but now even that opportunity's gone. This will be a complete reset of his career. By the time 1986 wraps up, Mark is more or less back on his feet. He won the ASA title that year and made a few more random starts in cup races, but nothing of note comes up. In 1987, Mark gets a full-time ride in the Busch Series, now the Xfinity Series. His team is small. They have just 2 cars, a short track car and a speedway car, and an open trailer. But Mark won 3 races and finished top 10 in the points. His plans for 1988 are up in the air, but he's about to be tapped to drive what will be one of the most iconic rides in NASCAR history. Jack Roush was a Ford loyalist who had made a name for himself in different road racing series across North America, and in 1988 he wants to tackle NASCAR racing. It's a hell of a jump, but he's got the backing of Ford and all of his sponsors lined up, with the personnel to see it through. The only thing he needs now is a driver. Wanting someone with experience in a past champion's provisional, he tries to coax Bobby Allison to drive his number 6 car, but Bobby declines and already has a deal with the Stavola brothers worked out. He points Jack towards a good fit for his operation though. He shockingly name drops the 4-time ASA champion from Arkansas, Mark Martin. Jack Roush is perplexed, but Bobby thinks Mark deserves a second shot, and pushes hard for Jack to pull the trigger on the short tracker. Jack Roush, not really knowing anybody else for the job, agrees and gives Mark the best phone call of his life. It also didn't hurt that Mark was a cheap date and hungry for work. First chances are rare in this line of work, and second chances are even rarer still. But Mark rises from the ashes and goes full-time in 1988, driving the Stroh's Light number 6 Ford Thunderbird. They kinda sucked, but hey, it was a new team, they're trying to get their sea legs underneath them. They were fairly fast but horrendously inconsistent. They did manage to nab a pole that year despite an average finishing position of 19th. They were mostly known for blowing a lot of engines, and I mean a lot of engines. For most teams, a blown motor or two could end the whole operation, especially for a young startup. But Jack Roush has deep pockets and a penchant for horsepower, so he keeps his nose to the grindstone and orders the team to go full speed ahead. They have 10 DNFs on the year, 4 of which were engine failures, and they would also fail to finish the last 3 races in a row. In 1989, they go back to the drawing board, and holy shit does it pay off. 6 poles, 14 top 5s, only 3 engine failures this time and 4 DNFs overall, but the biggest triumph? Win number 1 for an Arkansas kid with a new lease on life, who everybody except Bobby Allison had written off. 7 years ago it was unthinkable that he'd ever get to this point, but now it seems inevitable that the young man will go on to do great things. He finishes the year 3rd in points, and to think, next year is going to be even better. So how do we go from breaking stuff nearly every other week to competing for championships? Besides Mark Martin and Jack Roush, there's 2 other very important men in this equation that you should know about. Steve Meal was essentially the general manager of the team, who helped Jack Roush put all the necessary pieces in place. He has a substantial body of work in the upstate New York racing scene, and he brings in his childhood friend Robin Pemberton to crew chief the car. The two had great chemistry together, and not only that, but they knew what they were doing. They pretty much call all of the shots and have Jack sign the checks to get the necessary funds to see it through. After a forgettable Daytona 500, the team packs up for the freezing cold Richmond Fairgrounds and runs 3rd pretty much all day. A late caution after a long green flag stint forces everybody to pit, and Pemberton makes the call to go for right side tires only, so Mark can restart up front, thinking that this would secure an extra 5 bonus points for leading a lap. At worst, Mark would get swallowed up by Dale and Rusty and would still end up finishing 3rd. But that didn't happen. Mark muscles the car around the track, puts some distance between himself and 2nd, and wins race number 2 of his career. This would go on to be a trend for his 1990 campaign. They're playing it safe for points, and wins more or less just kind of fall in their lap. They are opportunists. They're not going out there just to kick faces in and make a statement. This strategy worked for the likes of Lee Petty and Bob Wellborn in the early days, and for Alan Prost in F1, so why not them too? However, in the tech shed after the race, Richard Childress is with a NASCAR official and is pointing at something on the number 6 car's motor. Eventually, the official makes the call, an illegal carburetor spacer that would cost the team $40,000 and 46 points, the equivalent to finishing a lap down. Okay, so the spacer was about half an inch taller than what was allowed at the time. Back in the day, a savvy mechanic could use this to cheat and leak extra air into the engine, but there was one problem. That's only if the spacer was bolted into place, but this spacer was welded, meaning that no air could have possibly got in. Plus, the team had been running the taller spacer since last year, and had never been bopped for it before. And even after they tested it, the extra height never produced any extra horsepower. It was just easier to build that way. They had essentially been penalized for a gray area rule that had never been enforced before. Pemberton and Meal protest the penalty and want it reduced at the very least. But Senior Vice President of Operations of NASCAR, Les Richter, upholds the decision and says to the Roush team, if you lose this championship, you had best lose it by more than 46 points. Benny Parsons, the next week, has some choice words for the harsh penalty.
They fined him $40,000 and 46 points. I mean, that's like hanging a guy for shoplifting.
Even still, the Roushketeers have 27 races still left to run and plenty of time to make up the deficit. They drop a cylinder at Rockingham the next week and finish 26th with a DNF, but bounce right back at Atlanta with a top 5 and never have another DNF all season. Their worst finish from here on out will be 14th. They will finish outside the top 10 just 4 times. At week 12 in Sonoma, they finish second and take the points lead. They'd hold on to it until week 27. They get their second win of the year at Michigan, and in September they take a rare opportunity to pounce on the man in second, Dale Earnhardt, and Mark wins a dogfight with the Intimidator to pad out its points lead just a little bit more. Dale Earnhardt has had to claw his way up the points all year, and by the halfway point he is finally in second. Sometimes he is just as little as 1 point back of Mark, but a poor finish is always right around the corner for him. He makes up for it by winning 9 races on the season compared to Mark's 3, and Dale's average finish is a respectable 8.0. But late in the year at the second to last race, Dale wins at Phoenix and finishes just a few spots ahead of Mark in the finale at Atlanta to win the Cup. The margin of victory? Just 26 points. Les Richter's words just seem all the more ominous now. But Mark, even to this day, doesn't see it that way. They had all year to make up for that penalty and couldn't get those few extra points. There were opportunities here and there that they didn't take, and eventually all those few little points scattered across the season would come back to bite them. Even still, the team believes they can get one of these championships eventually. No need to get down in the dumps now. At the time, this was just Dale's 4th championship ever. Eventually, he'd go on to be arguably the greatest driver of his era, if not of all time. With just 76 wins in total under his belt, he nabbed 7 championships in 14 years. And for his final Cup, he will have to do battle with the Arkansas Kid just one more time. Surely with so much success in such a short period, Roush's merry band of men could pull off the upset if given a second opportunity, right? Up next, Trouble in Paradise delays the inevitable. Describes his 1991 and 92 seasons as forgettable, and 1994 wasn't any better. Most fans of his can rattle off 4 or 5 of his runner-up finishes, but they will always have trouble with this one, the one that even Mark himself brushes off. No, seriously, on his podcast where he talks about every season of his career, he combined the 1994, 95, and 96 seasons all together, and even then it's still about the average length of one episode. To him, these years just didn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. And who am I to disagree? So let's just skip this one and move on with the series. So yeah, that's the end of this video, folks. Until next time, y'all take it easy. Okay, no, sorry, come back, sorry, there's a lot to talk about here, so go ahead and take a seat and let's get into it.
If you wouldn't mind just taking your seats again, please, that would be fantastic. Take your seat, take your fucking seats, take your seats.
In 1991 and 1992, Mark got a combined 3 wins, and neither year was all that remarkable. They were never really in the hunt for the title at any point, although they finished 6th in the points both times, and Mark was even mathematically eligible for the Cup at the final race in 1992. But he pretty much needed for everybody ahead of him to wreck out in the first 50 laps, go out, win, and lead the most laps himself. But even if that had happened, Mark ended up with a mechanical failure in that race and ended up way back in the field. I've talked about the 1992 finale to death on this channel. If you want to watch those videos, they're in the description, so I'll spare you the details. But rather importantly, between the 1991 and 92 seasons, Mark gets a new sponsor and some eye-catching colors to sport for the rest of the decade. The now iconic red, white, and blue Valvoline scheme. A paint job so memorable that even to this day, others are still taking inspiration from it or just straight up copying it. But right out of the gate, it doesn't seem to be inspiring any better performance. However, what is a big change from the last few years is Mark's ever-growing fan base, which by 1993 includes me too. Mark is now a household name in the NASCAR-loving South. In the span of a year or two, he went from a nobody to one of the sport's biggest stars, and all without the help of the internet too. He's a fan favorite, and rightly so. In an era of Dale Earnhardt, Jeff Bodine, Rusty Wallace, and Darrell Waltrip all going at it and wrecking each other every chance they got, it was nice to see a guy who was squeaky clean and let his driving do the talking for him. If Mark beat your driver, then you had no right to be mad. Mark was just flat out better that day. He didn't wreck his opponents, take cheap shots, or cheat. And even that one time he did, it was proven that it didn't help him. It was just an honest-to-God oversight by his crew. You just couldn't make up excuses against him, and that in turn drew in more fans. But in 1993, there's trouble in paradise. Despite wins and respectable points finishes, Mark is starting to get unhappy with the team. The way Roush Racing worked at the time, and even worked all the way up until Mark left in 2006, was pretty demanding of the driver. Mark wasn't just a steering wheel technician and pedal operator. He was neck deep in the operations of his own team. He got to pick his own crew chief and even his pit crew members. If one guy was falling short, it was up to Mark to go out and find a replacement. Hell, if he even wanted so much as a fan installed on his car, he had to go out and procure one from somewhere and mount it and wire it to the battery himself. Nowadays, it's almost unheard of for a driver to be that hands-on with the operations of his or her team. I mean, at that point, you're pretty much just an owner-driver who doesn't have to worry about finances. But actually, for Mark, he did still have to worry about dollars and cents. Mark had good people he wanted to bring into the shop, but Jack Roush was a businessman first and a racer second. If one guy looked a bit too pricey, Jack would say no. He was in the money-making business, and if he could find a bargain somewhere, he'd take that over the sure thing. But I mean, to be fair, who could blame him? He took a chance on Mark because he was cheap, and that had worked out fine, right? But Mark just finds it distracting. And come on, when you're competing for championships and it comes time to set up your car for next week's race, and doing something as simple as installing a cup holder in your car requires you to engineer it for yourself from scratch, yeah, that's pretty damn distracting. And it does slowly leach away at your performance. Mark even goes so far as to go out job hunting. And one intriguing ride is Junior Johnson's flagship number 11 car. But there's even bigger trouble over there. Bill Elliott goes winless in 1993 for them, and the team is in shambles. Mark decides against jumping ship and instead pushes for his team to make some improvements. The big thing was he wanted to hang the bodies on the chassis a certain way. And some of the members of his team were fighting him on that. But after they went winless halfway through the season, they relented and hung the bodies the way Mark wanted. And then they won 4 in a row. And it wasn't like they just got lucky with a streak of similar tracks, far from it. Those 4 wins in a row came at Watkins Glen, Michigan, Bristol, and Darlington. They went from a road course to a 2-mile superspeedway to a short track, and then ended it with, well, whatever the hell Darlington is. Mark's new crew chief is somebody that we've talked about before. Steve Mill is really jiving with the new setups, and his mechanical wizardry is instrumental to the team's success. After Robin Pemberton left to join Sabco, Mill dropped down from an executive position at Roush to crew chief the car, and his talent shone through as soon as they figured the bodies out. However, their earlier struggles would put them behind Dale and Rusty, and they'd end up the year 3rd in points. In 1994, things should end up being far better. One would think anyway. Instead, they only nab 2 wins and barely stumble into the runners-up position at season's end. They do so at the very last race by leading the most laps and winning the race. And in that last race, they literally needed every single point possible up for grabs just to barely sneak into the 2nd place position. They won and led the most laps. And even then, they lost to Dale Earnhardt again by 44 points. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say 44 points? Wait a second, I meant 444 points. I forgot a 4 there, my bad. Dale Earnhardt mathematically locked up the championship some time ago, and in this championship campaign he won just 4 races, but matched his average finish from 1990 with 8.0 flat. His secret that year? Just being wildly consistent when everybody else floundered. Pretty much the complete opposite of what went down in 1990. Oh, that and the ongoing tire war that year. That probably had a lot to do with it too. Look, when your competition is getting thinned out by slow and somewhat dangerous Hoosier tires, that always helps your chances. Dale and Richard Childress Racing were firmly in the Goodyear camp, but so were Mark and Roush Racing. Their problem? 3 crashes and 3 engine failures. And that's not even all of their DNFs. Dale had only 3 the entire season. Maybe the tire war was a distraction, and RCR stuck with what they knew and played it cool while the world around them descended into chaos. Jeff Bodine had taken over the late Alan Kawicki's team and was on a tear, but equipment failures dogged him all year. We also had 11 different winners in 1994 in just 31 races, which shook things up even more. Mark was vocally against the tire war and said, "We need one tire company. Then we would have the one tire we need at each track." I'm really proud to have lived to talk about the 1994 tire war. It's just not worth it, man. Yeah, that's how bad it was. Guys were just happy to live through it, and in the final race in Atlanta, Hoosier had 3 major blowouts. One sent rookie prospect Loy Allen to the hospital, and another was a horrifying fiery crash that required Jeff Bodine's team to jump the pit wall and drag their driver to safety. That embarrassment of a final showing was enough to make Hoosier drop out of NASCAR's top series completely, and return to being the sole tire supplier of the Modifieds and ARCA. Like I said earlier, this year didn't matter much to Mark, and I'm not one to argue with the GOAT, so let's move on to his 1995 and 96 struggles. He went on a tear in 1995, winning 4 races, but he'd wind up 4th in the points after a young phenom named Jeff Gordon beat the pants off of everyone and won 7 races. And in 96, he went winless, but a new crew chief named Jimmy Finnig is about to figure everything out and put Mark on a collision course with destiny. That starts with 4 wins in 1997. Including a win at Sonoma to break his winless streak, and a win at Talladega that still stands as the fastest race ever run in the Cup Series. Although they'd swapped the points lead back and forth with Gordon for several weeks, a late season stumble and the rise of Dale Jarrett would see them only end up 3rd at season's end. You know what? At this point it seems like we've tried everything. We played it safe for points, and that didn't work. We tried a late season rebound and some innovative trickery, and that didn't work. We literally built the fastest car of the 90s, and that didn't work either. You know what? Screw it. Let's just go for fucking broke. Up next, Mark Martin decides to go out and have the best season of his entire career. The only problem is, somebody else had the exact same idea. NASCAR is more than just racing. I would say first and foremost, it is an ever-unfolding tapestry of rivalries. The King versus the Silver Fox, Dale Earnhardt versus Bill Elliott, Darrell Waltrip versus Bobby Allison, Joey Logano versus, well, everyone. And the list goes on forever, it seems like. However, some of the greatest drivers of all time seem to have never had that one guy that got the best of them and pushed them to new heights. In the case of Jeff Gordon, he was so good that it seemed like he had no equal. No one could challenge his reign over the 90s. He did have run-ins with the likes of Brad Keselowski and most notably his teammate later in his career, Jimmy Johnson, but by then it had become apparent that the torch had been passed, and Jimmy was no longer the apprentice, but the master. Retroactively, a lot of people have tried to arbitrarily latch a rivalry onto Jeff Gordon's 1990s legacy. Some have placed Dale Earnhardt Sr. in that role, but in actuality the two rarely had any heated words to exchange with the other, if any at all. Earnhardt actually respected Jeff, and clearly saw that he would be the flag bearer for the sport moving forward. Jeff did lose a nail-biter of a championship to Terry Labonte in 1996, in which Jeff won 10 races to Terry's 2, but Jeff was uncharacteristically inconsistent that year, and Terry pulled away for just his second title in 12 years. He'd never rival Jeff like that ever again. There was one season, however, where someone not only gave Jeff a run for his money, but would continue to hound him and push him to new heights year after year, and would even go on to best him in the championship standings several more times in the future. The two pushed each other to their absolute best, and in 1998, the two would have the best statistical years of their careers. And the man that stepped up to fill that void was none other than Mark the Kid Martin. In 1998, across 33 races run that season, Mark and Jeff combined to win a staggering 20 of those. In the modern era, that has only happened 2 other times in NASCAR history, in 1982 and 1974. It really is just insane to think about. 2 guys won 60% of the races that season. No one else scored more than 3 wins. That kind of domination in a single season hasn't happened since and will likely never happen again. In an era notable for its parity, where it seemed like anybody could win on any given weekend, this was just totally out of left field. Mark and Jeff's stats for this season are absolutely legendary. It's like something you'd put together on career mode in a NASCAR video game if you set the difficulty down to the lowest possible level. These two were just on a completely different planet that year. The story of their record-breaking campaigns can actually trace its origins to 1997. That year, they traded the points lead back and forth 3 times in the back half of the season, as they stood 1 and 2 in the standings for 12 weeks straight. But late in the year, Mark began to falter, and Dale Jarrett would take the second spot. Mark would finish the season 3rd in the points, just 29 back of Gordon, who got his second championship. Fast forward to February 1998, and the board is reset for a new season. NASCAR celebrates its 50th anniversary, and Dale Earnhardt finally triumphs in his storied Dale vs. Daytona saga, claiming his first Daytona 500 and one of the sport's most iconic moments. We all remember the crew members of every team coming out on pit lane to congratulate Dale on finally nabbing the one race that had eluded him for so long. But lost in everyone's recollections is that for Jeff and Mark, that race was pretty forgettable. Jeff finished 16th and Mark wrecked out late, finishing 38th. As high-powered as this season would end up being, it has very humble beginnings. Although Jeff would win the next week at Rockingham, his finishes in the successive weeks are not championship caliber. 17th at Las Vegas and 19th at Atlanta. He gets a runner-up at Darlington and then a second win at Bristol, which is then followed up by a DNF at Texas. Mark's numbers are just about identical here. He won at Vegas and Texas, but has a 25th at Atlanta, and a couple of sub-20th place finishes a few races after that. These are not championship numbers at all. They're nabbing a win and a top 10 in exchange for a 20th place finish or worse. It is extremely difficult to win the Winston Cup under those circumstances. And although Jeff Gordon has clawed his way to the championship points lead by the time the 600 wraps up at the end of May, he barely leads over the Penske teammates of Rusty Wallace and Jeremy Mayfield. And in week 13 of competition, he wrecks out late from a spin caused by Rusty himself. At this point, Jeremy Mayfield claims the points lead, and Mark and Jeff find themselves sitting 3rd and 4th in the points respectively. This is supposed to be one of the most dominating seasons by any 2 drivers ever. So when does this start? Yeah, they have 3 wins apiece after just 13 races, but the season is just 33 races long. Only 61% of the schedule remains, and these guys need to throw it into overdrive if they want to reach greatness. And they do. What ensues is just utter domination by these two. Going forward, they will combine for just 5 finishes outside the top 5 for the remainder of the year. That's right, 40 combined starts, and they finished worse than 5th just 5 times. Every time they cranked up their engines from here on out, they ran 87.5% odds of getting a top 5 that day. That's just insane. They went back and forth, winning 14 of the next 20 races, and there was just no opportunity for anybody else to challenge them. They kept adding to their point lead and left everybody else behind them. No longer tethered to the confines of reasonable expectations, they climbed ever higher into the realm of greatness. They laid waste to the field around them, as they had essentially put the NASCAR world on easy mode. They finished 1-2-5 times that year, including 3 times in a row in the summer stretch at Pocono, Indianapolis, and Watkins Glen. The two of them would lead 3,447 combined laps, more than the next 5 drivers in the standings put together. They amassed so many points that third in the standings, Dale Jarrett, would need at least 4 races where they didn't show up, and he scored the maximum allowable points all 4 times to surpass them. Jeff Gordon almost locked up the championship with 2 races remaining, needing only to start the second to last race at Rockingham to clinch the cup. Watching this as an 8-year-old, I didn't really grasp at the time how impressive this was. When you're a kid, you don't know what the rules are or what's to be expected from drivers. You're not jaded with age and you're always shooting for the stars. Nothing seems out of reach, and you expect everybody else to have that outlook too. In reality, it's very rare that something like that ever happens in our day-to-day lives. That's where the magic of sports comes into play. There, the incredible happens on a weekly basis, with circus catches, insane triple plays, and lights-out performances galore. In motorsports, though, these moments are more few and far between, and that's what makes them all the more special. And watching Mark Martin and Jeff Gordon shoot for the moon week in and week out was a 33-week-long opera that captured my imagination more than any other series of events in sports has ever before or since. To this day, it is still my favorite season in NASCAR history. Now, let's address the elephant in the room here. Jeff was by far the heavier lifter in this 2-man performance. Of the 20 wins they scored that year, Jeff accounts for 13 of them compared to Mark's 7, nearly double. He also had more top 5s and more top 10s, although it's admittedly close. What really set them apart, however, was how bad their few bad days were. When Jeff fell off of his game, he merely got a top 10 or a top 15. When Mark had an issue, it usually resulted in a sub-25th place finish. Of those 5 outside the top 5 finishes that occurred in the back 2/3 of the season, Mark accounted for 4 of them. This unfortunate series of events for Mark is represented in their average finish for the season. Martin's 8.6 is incredible, and would have easily been championship caliber in just about any other season. But Jeff's average finish was an otherworldly 5.7. An average finish at the end of a season in the 5 bracket or better has only ever happened 5 times in the history of NASCAR's modern era, and it has never happened since. The 90s were truly an era of Jeff Gordon versus the NASCAR world, and while a few drivers would best him in the standings in the years after, no one pushed him as hard as Mark Martin had done in 1998. Sometimes the best athletes need other greats to push them into the uncharted heights of greatness. Steel sharpens steel after all, and their 20-win season is still in a 3-way tie as the most wins by any 2 drivers in the modern era to this day. Actually, it would be 21 wins if you wanted to count the All-Star race that year. Jeff Gordon dominated that race, and a repeat of what he had done the year prior with his now fabled T-Rex car that got effectively banned the next day after it had won. But I must admit that I probably altered the outcome of this race. You see, I was there attending that race. As Mark Martin passed Bobby Labonte on the last lap and claimed the second spot, Jeff Gordon had a sizable lead, and all he had to do was coast to the finish. But in my seat, just at the exit of Turn 4 where Mark had completed his pass to get the second spot, I said a little prayer, hoping Mark would overtake Jeff in the final lap and nab his first All-Star trophy. And going into Turn 1 on the last lap, Jeff's engine expired, and Mark came around and won the race along with the $1 million paycheck that came with it. Just a few days before my birthday, I got to see my favorite driver win the All-Star race and best his biggest rival. Going back to the topic of Jeff's 13 wins, he tied the modern era record for most wins in a season that year. The other man to do this? Well, obviously it was the king himself, Richard Petty. In 1975, he also netted 13 wins in a single season. Although in 1998, Jeff had a good bit of help considering that he ran a 33-race schedule, whereas Petty ran 30 races in 1975. As a matter of fact, Jeff won his 12th and 13th races in the second-to-last and last races of the season, respectively. Had the schedule not been lengthened, he would have ended up with a still impressive 11-win season. His 13th and final win of 1998 came with some controversy too. Atlanta played host to the season finale back then, and the newly reconfigured track had just been outfitted with lights. As fate would have it, the race endured hours of rain delays. And despite being well past the halfway point, NASCAR flicked on the lights and waited it out until almost midnight as Jeff overtook Dale Jarrett and captured his record-tying win. Even with a 33-race schedule, Gordon's win percentage in 1998 sits at a jaw-dropping 39.4%. Had he gotten those wins in a 30-race season like the King did, he would have a ludicrous 43.3% win percentage on the season. These two single-season win percentages stand as the best and third best in modern NASCAR history. If you want to make a run at being the greatest NASCAR driver of all time, you're going to have to prove it by surpassing, tying, or at least coming close to this benchmark. With a longer 36-race schedule these days, combined with a championship format that doesn't value insane stats like these as much anymore, these two will likely sit at the top of the pile forever. The 1998 season was a hell of a time to be a NASCAR fan. Sure, by today's metrics, it would have been pretty boring on a week-to-week basis. You had basically coin flip odds of guessing who was going to win week in and week out at any given track, and the points lead Jeff had built up by the end of the summer stretch was pretty much insurmountable. But if you really want to watch what happens when two of the sport's best are on their A-game for a 33-week-long war, then the 1998 season is your cup of tea. Anyway, I'm Slapshoes. Thanks for watching. It's September 29th, 2002 at Kansas Speedway, and what should have easily been one of the greatest championship points battles of all time is about to go straight to hell. Mark Martin leads the points going into this race, and all he needs to do to maintain his lead is finish in the top 10. He'll later say of all of his championship runner-up finishes that this one hurt the most.
The point leader has stalled. They're pushing him down pit road. The car will not refire.
But before we get into all that, let's take a look at what Mark's been up to in the meantime. His 1998 season was just legendary and would have easily been championship caliber in any other season, but Jeff Gordon put a stop to that. Mark bounced back though and won 2 events in 1999 and finished 3rd in the standings. Not bad at all. In 2000 he only won 1 race and finished 8th in the points. Again, not bad. But in 2001 he hits a brick wall. No wins, only 3 top 5s, and 12th in the standings. Okay, now something is definitely wrong. Roush Racing had a hard time with the aerodynamics of the 2001 Ford Taurus, and they were behind the 8 ball all year. The only driver to score any wins for them was Jeff Burton at Charlotte and Phoenix. Adding to the pressure Mark is feeling is his new sponsor Viagra. Yeah, go ahead and make your jokes, but they were instrumental in the team's success throughout the 2000s. Valvoline had wanted to stay with the team, but Pfizer makes a deal with Roush, which at the time was the biggest sponsorship deal in NASCAR history. Not only are they sending millions to the team, but Pfizer is going on a full-on ad blitz across every network that carries NASCAR races. Mark signs on the dotted line on the agreement that they put an emphasis on the men's health aspect of their work. Pfizer agrees and spends millions raising awareness on men's health topics that have been stigmatized before, getting regular checkups, testing for prostate and testicular cancer, and many other issues. And wouldn't you know it, death rates from those types of cancer went on the decline after that. Laugh all you want, Mark Martin and Viagra saved lives, folks. I'll defend that one to the grave. But during this time, it was really hard being a Mark Martin fan. No pun intended, again, take your jokes elsewhere. But you'd tell somebody that Mark was your favorite race car driver and people would inevitably go, "Oh yeah, that's the Viagra guy, right? Yeah, that's the guy." Even buying Mark Martin merch was pretty difficult, especially as a kid in middle school at this time. A lot of photos of the car and Mark in his fire suit were obviously poorly censored with Photoshop. And add that to his waning performance out on the track, and these were some seriously dark days for his fans. But even with all that extra income from the Viagra deal, Roush flounders all year. Thankfully, they have a multi-year contract in place and have time to fix the problems that ail them. Mark, though, is starting to have some serious doubts creep up into his mind for the first time since the early 80s. Is he washed up? Is this it? Is he ever going to win another race? It seems silly to think now that he was considering himself a has-been in the early 2000s, knowing what we know today, but it's a legit concern in 2001. He's in his 40s now and he knows he's running out of time as a driver. He has at most another 10 years ahead of him. He goes into the 2002 season, unsure of himself and his future. But Jack Roush has a plan in place to deal with the malaise of his teams. Kurt Busch was a young, fast, and brash driver, and Jack had originally given him a team of young, brash people to work with, thinking that like minds would come together and accomplish great things. But the team is all over the place and needs guidance. Mark Martin's team, however, is full of older, more established members that have been working with the organization for over a decade. Jimmy Finnig, who had orchestrated Mark's 1998 dominance, is sent to stabilize Kurt Busch, and Busch's crew chief is sent over to Mark. His name is Ben Leslie. As unpredictable as he was genius, in 2002 Ben will give Mark one of the most consistent seasons of his entire career, but in 2003 he'll give him one of his most inconsistent. The young man has other young crew members joining him in the migration, and Mark's knowledge of setup seeps into the team and they start running like they should again. The aero of the cars is figured out, and a reinvigorated Mark Martin sets out into 2002 with high hopes. He finishes 6th in the Daytona 500 and has some finishes all over the place in the early stages of the season. But in May, he strikes gold. Fending off his hard-charging teammate Matt Kenseth, Mark wins his first Coca-Cola 600 and won $1 million in the No Bull 5 event. Back in the Winston Cup days for 5 Crown Jewel events throughout the year, the top 5 in the points would be eligible for $1 million payout if they could win that race. And NASCAR put orange highlights on the car so fans could easily identify them. Mark had come close to the prize before, but this was the first time he pulled it off. And before the race, he promised his team that if they won, he'd share half of the winnings with them, hoping that they'd put in a little extra effort. It worked, and in victory lane, Mark said that was the hardest he had ever driven a race car and won. After this race, he sits 3rd in the points, a good 143 points short of the points leader, who had been on top of the pile since week 2. And that gets us into one of the best and most forgotten points battles in NASCAR history. So let's talk about the man that many say should have walked away with the cup at season's end, a guy from Tennessee with a really fun to say name. If I had told you back in the 90s that Sterling Marlin would be poised to win a championship in the early 2000s and would lead the vanguard for Dodge's return to NASCAR, you would have told me I was out of my skull insane. For most of his career, Marlin looked like just another journeyman driver, like his old man Cuckoo Marlin. Man, this family just has a lot of great names. But in 1994, a deal with Morgan McClure Motorsports sees him win his first race of his career at the Daytona 500. And then he followed it up by winning the race again in 1995, becoming one of only 3 drivers to date who have ever won back-to-back 500s. He went on to win at Darlington and Talladega that year as well. But by 1997, it's become apparent to him that Morgan McClure have put all of their eggs in the super speedway basket, and they're struggling everywhere else. He nabs only 2 top 5s that year and jumps ship to Sabco in 1998, but doesn't fare much better. Going into 2001, he hasn't done much with the team, but an IndyCar big shot named Chip Ganassi is about to partner up with Felix Sabates of Sabco and create a real powerhouse team with Dodge support. Marlin immediately goes on a tear, winning 2 races and finishing 3rd in the points. In 2002, he's looking even better, and likely would have won the Daytona 500 a 3rd time had he not done this under the red flag.
The car, Sterling Marlin is jumping out of his car. He's going around to look at the right front fender. But, he can't do that.
Hey, people call this a boneheaded move, but what else was he supposed to do? Run around with a tire rub for a few laps and cause an accident? Hell, I say take the chance, see what happens. Even after taking a penalty for that and restarting at the back of the field, he still battles back and finishes 8th. He spins and wins at Las Vegas, and then wins at Darlington, and he leads the points from round 2 all the way until week 27. A late season collapse is looking more and more likely, but as week 29 of 36 rolls around, he's going to a lot of tracks that favor him heavily. He won the Fall Charlotte race last year, and their Super Speedway package is fantastic, and Talladega is just next week. If they avoid DNFs and win those 2 races, they'll have themselves a cup at the end of the year. But Marlin's got some serious competition to deal with. After week 28 at Dover, Mark holds a narrow lead over the rookie sensation named Jimmy Johnson. No rookie has ever won the championship or even led the standings up to this point in NASCAR history, and the California kid looks to pull off the upset of the century. Speaking of upsets, sitting at 3rd in the points is a Hoosier and former open wheeler named Tony Stewart, and the outsider is looking to nab a title in just his 4th full-time season. He is 74 points back of Mark and a mere 7 ahead of Marlin. This is going to be an intense final stretch of races, but on week 29 at Kansas, what should have been the greatest title fight since 1992 goes straight to hell. On lap 147, Marlin takes a vicious crash into the turn 2 wall and breaks a vertebra in his neck. The man who had led the points for 26 weeks and had a rebound just in his sights is out for the remainder of the year. He's walking around and talking immediately after the wreck, but doctors will not clear him to race in the weeks ahead. The crash would effectively end his winning days. He never won another race and only netted 4 top 5s before he retired at the end of the 2009 season. In this line of work, fate is a cruel mistress, and the racing gods care not what you think you deserve. Mark Martin has been hanging around in the top 20 all day. He's led 1 lap on a pit cycle move to get another 5 bonus points, but late in the race he makes his move to the front. Turns out he was just hanging out mid-pack playing it safe. And now it's time to pounce. He's pleaded with Jack Roush all week, just give me a motor that can go the whole race. I don't need any extra horsepower, I just need to finish. He's inside the top 10, right where he needs to be. But with just 17 laps to go, Mark drops a cylinder and can't even get the car out of the pit box without his crew pushing it. He eventually parks the car and calls it a day. He finishes 25th. Jimmie Johnson takes the points lead and still to this day is the only rookie to ever lead the points, but he wouldn't sit atop the standings for long. Tony Stewart finishes second at Talladega the very next week. And in that race, Mark Martin and Jimmie Johnson collide together on the pace laps when Mark's steering column locks up, in a freak accident. Mark finishes 30th, and Jimmie, as well as every other Hendrick-affiliated team, blows a motor. With first and second out of the way, Tony Stewart takes the points lead and cruises to his first of 3 championship titles, after battling back from finishing dead last in the Daytona 500 and a litany of controversies with the media. Mark Martin and Ben Leslie, in their desperation, even got docked another 25 points at Rockingham for an unimproved coil spring, but they still get the runner-up spot and gather themselves back up and press forward into 2003. They go winless and finish the year out 17th in points. By the end of that year, Ben Leslie is ousted and Pat Trison takes over crew chiefing duties and gives Mark a win apiece in 2004 and 2005, and 4th in the points both years. In 2005, Mark announces that this will be his final full-time season, and he wants to go part-time in 2006. But Jack Roush needs 1 year to find a replacement driver, so he and Mark agree to a 1-season deal in 2006, and Mark makes it to the chase for the 3rd year in a row. He's in the hunt all the way up until Charlotte when a rookie J.J. Yaley pulls a Quinn Houff and decides to pit from the middle lane. The crash is a scary looking one, but Mark walks away and in his post-race interview he just seems absolutely irate. But more than that, it just seems like he's given up hope.
Championship is not really something that was meant to be for me ever.
That one sentence hurt me more than any one of his championship runner-ups. It was like he was resigned to his fate at this point, and if he had given up hope, then I had to as well. Mark finished the year 9th in the standings, and I waited to hear what his plans were for 2007. It came out in the off-season that he had signed with MB2 Motorsports to take over Joe Nemechek's ride in the 01 Army Chevy. I was perplexed as to what he saw in the team, but in the Daytona 500 that year, he showed everyone that team was exactly what he wanted it to be. He took the lead late and drove the race of his life, and coming out of the final corner of the final lap, I fully expected NASCAR to throw the caution as they had in every other instance up to that point in last lap superspeedway pileups. They never did.
Here they come, checkered flag.
This is not happenstance. This is malicious torment. This is the racing gods telling you no. This is not meant for you. Not now, not ever. You must make peace with that or let it eat at you forever. Maybe we should have seen it coming. Maybe it should have been obvious now looking back at it that a guy who thought number 1 was too brash and cocky and purposefully chose number 2 finds himself in second so frustratingly often. At the beginning of the year, South Carolina real estate mogul Bobby Ginn bought out MB2 Motorsports, and by August 2007, everybody's onto the fact that he's a complete huckster who's out of money. So, Ginn Motorsports merges with the fledgling DEI team, and Mark never gets close to victory lane for the rest of the year. In 2008, he had fast cars, but just couldn't put it all together. One race at Phoenix looks like he has it in the bag after Mark goes half throttle for the entire final pit cycle, and assures his crew chief, Tony Gibson, that he can make it on fuel and snooker a win away from the field. However, Tony is under strict orders to get the car into the top 10 in owner points and plays it safe. Mark had lost the same race in 2006 by coming up short on fuel, and he's learned from his mistakes and begs to be left out on the track. But eventually, he begrudgingly pits for gas and finishes 5th. Mark's contract is up at the end of the year, and in 2009, I fully expect Mark to call it quits. He's got nothing left to prove. 35 wins, many more in the Xfinity Series, a handful of wins in the Truck Series, 1 ARCA win, 4 ASA titles, and even 5 championships in the International Race of Champions, the most of any driver in its 30 years of competition. But one day, after a rough day at work, I come home and see my dad in the kitchen. It was rare for him to beat me home from his job, and he just pops his head from behind the wall and asks, "Did you hear the news?" I had been at work all day, so I answer, "No, what?" My dad just smirks and says, "Mark Martin's going to be driving full-time next year for Hendrick." I remember I stopped taking off my boots and I just looked at my dad like what he had just said to me was some kind of sick joke. But he assures me that it isn't. I go to my room, fire up the laptop, and sure enough, my dad wasn't lying to me. My favorite driver was going to drive the flagship car of the best team in motorsports full-time next year. We started this series off by saying how first chances in this line of work are rare, and second chances are even rarer still. But Mark Martin, ever a defier of the odds, is about to get a third chance. He says his only objective going forward is just to win one more race, but he's about to do so much more than that. Other than a win, he just wants to go out and have as much fun as possible. You know, we've tried playing the points game, we've tried late season rebounds, we've gone for broke, we've even gone into a late season point slugfest, and we even set a litany of new records. But what if we didn't try? Up next, fifth time's a charm, right? Year for any Mark Martin fan. By this point, it had been 4 years since his last win, and the news that he was returning to full-time competition threw a lot of us off guard. In 2007, Mark had started the first 4 events of the year and got 3 top 5s with a worst finish of 10th. But his part-time schedule meant that he'd skipped the short tracks, super speedways, and road courses. Not because he was bad at them, quite the opposite. He practically owned Watkins Glen, and he was a short track setup wizard. And with Roush horsepower under the hood, he was better at the plate tracks than most. But when you can essentially run a schedule of your own choosing for funsies, you'd be surprised what tracks you're willing to give up on just so you can sleep in on Sundays. Mark actually led the points going into the 5th race at Bristol, and his car owner Bobby Ginn had given Mark the option to run full-time at any point of his own choosing. And going into the Bristol Spring race, rumors were swirling that Mark would go full-time again. He had talked a big game back in 2005 about retiring, but came back, and maybe he'd get the bug again. There were even sightings of him at the track that week, but he was just merely advising Regan Smith, who was filling in for him. Mark kept his word and did not start at Bristol or any other track that he had originally vowed not to race at, save for the July Daytona race, and only because his runner-up finish at the 500 had given him an itch that he just had to scratch. He finished 17th that night and never made that same mistake again. But this schedule that he had made for himself ahead of time left one serious blind spot for him. He completely omitted any Car of Tomorrow races, aka the Gen 5 car. The COT was to be used by every team at a few races throughout 2007, and more in 2008, until it went full-time in 2009. Eventually, NASCAR would speed up the program and have the COT go full-time in 2008. But this omission by Mark was likely a move to give Smith the wheel time over himself. I mean, if he's going to be retiring soon, why bother trying to figure out this new car? Might as well let the new kid take a stab at it and just mentor him as best as you can. In 2008, Mark is with the same team, albeit after they merged with DEI, and he brings his Army sponsorship over to Dale Jr.'s old ride, the number 8. Now he splits driving duties with Eric Almirola, and has no choice but to wheel around the COT to the best of his abilities. But Mark excels at dealing with unknown conditions. If the Cup Series went to a racetrack for the first time, you had to watch out for Mark. He won the first race ever at Las Vegas, as well as the second races ever at California and Texas. And he's actually really good in the COT, despite having less seat time in it than a rookie would. He sits on the front row 5 times, and by the end of the year he's racking up top 10s like they're going out of style. But midway through the year, Mark is starting to get some strange phone calls from one Rick Hendrick, the owner of the best team in motorsports currently, and that's not an exaggeration in 2008. Red Bull hadn't gone on their tear yet in F1, IndyCar was kind of all over the place, and Audi hadn't come onto the scene yet at Le Mans and start kicking faces in there. Rick is asking Mark about his Army sponsorship and whether that's with the team or with him. Does he like what he's doing right now? What are his plans going forward, etc., etc. Mark had never really been friends with Rick up to this point, so after a few awkward phone calls, Mark finally takes the bait. Hey Rick, let's cut to the chase. What do you want? Rick lays it all out on the table. I want you to drive the 5 car full-time in 2009. Mark's had some offers like this come down the pipe in the last few months, but this one is different. This is the flagship car of the best team in the business. And make no mistake about it, the 5 car was Hendrick Motorsports' premier car. It was their first car they ever fielded. Jeff Bodine had gotten their first win in it, as well as their first Daytona 500, and virtually every single driver who had jumped in that seat posted top 5s and wins week in and week out, year after year. If you got the number 5 ride, the expectation was you were going to win often and compete for championships. Bottom line. To say that Mark is tempted is an understatement, but he really wants to stay part-time, racing only 24 times per year. Rick won't budge at first, but then eases on his terms and gives Mark an offer too good to pass up. 3 years in the 5 car, 2 of which will be part-time on whatever basis Mark wants, on the condition that Mark goes full-time in 2009, so Rick can work somebody up the ladder to go part-time in 2010. Mark's ready to take the deal, but he has to ask for permission first. He's made some promises to a certain someone, and now we get to talk about the person who has kept this hot mess of a man together throughout all these years. The rock that has steadied Mark through the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, Mrs. Arlene Martin. Mark and Arlene were originally set up on a blind date by Mark's sister, Glenda. And at first, Arlene has very little interest in a relationship with a man that's younger than her and has no quote-unquote real job, and instead drives race cars for a living. Pretty understandable, but after some time they really hit it off and they get hitched in October of 1984. Literally the only good thing to happen to Mark that year. She stayed by his side through thick and thin, and when he brings up the topic to her to go back full-time in 2009, she gives him the green light. She figures she's been on this crazy ride for 25 or so years, so what's one more full-time season in the grand scheme of things, right? Mark calls up Rick Hendrick and agrees to his terms. 1 year full-time, and then he drops back to his usual 24-race schedule for the next 2. And the time Mark has been mulling over the offer, he's been doing some surveillance of his own. He's been eavesdropping on radios on his off weeks and knows that his crew chief will be a good fit. He's a young guy but has a lot of potential, and he's already won with the likes of Kyle Busch. He's still in the sport today and is currently on a hot streak with Chase Elliott. The guy I'm talking about is, of course, Alan Gustafsson. Alan is actually in the midst of working on a new set of cars for 2009, and when Mark gets to the shop and starts working with the team, both he and Alan click right off the bat. Arlene sees Mark with a big dumb smile on his face every time he comes back from the shop. She hasn't seen him like this in years, and she asks what his deal is. Mark just simply tells her, it's like working at NASA. Roush, Ginn, and DEI were all pretty old school operations, but Hendrick is closer to an F1 team. They have engineers assigned to each team whose entire job it is to get little minute details squared away. Whereas in the past, Mark himself would have to buy and wire fans to the car and even set up his own racing seat. Now he has people whose sole job it is to do all of that stuff for him. They also have tons of equipment in-house that would normally be rented out or leased with other teams. And overall, the operation is so smooth it has more in common with the space program than a NASCAR shop. This isn't just a big move for Mark, it's also big for Hendrick. By this time, Mark has gained a reputation for reinvigorating teams that he signs with. And after a less than stellar 2008 season, Hendrick's 5 team needs a shot in the arm. And as soon as the guys learn that Mark is going to be their new driver, they set off into overdrive and everyone is walking around with a little extra pep in their step. Plus, the Hendrick lineup for 2009 is a super team for the ages. If you told somebody in the early 2000s that Jeff Gordon, Jimmy Johnson, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Mark Martin were all going to be on the same team, the reaction probably would have been, okay, what kind of salary cap is NASCAR going to enact now? Because these guys are obviously just going to win everything. But Mark's only objective for this year is just to win one more race, and now he feels like it's practically guaranteed. They load up for Daytona in February and Mark sits on the outside pole. He's never had a car this fast for the Great American Race, and for the first time he's actually looking forward to a plate race. However, he would only manage a 16th place finish, but he stays out of any serious trouble. Going into California and Vegas, he blows 2 motors and the team is now scrambling to get their stuff together and give Mark the results he deserves. By week 5 at Bristol, they have 2 poles and nab their first top 10 with a 6th place finish at the half mile. He gets 2 more top 10s and then they set off for Phoenix to the race that has been right in Mark's grasp 2 of the last 3 years. The night of the race, I had reconnected with an old high school friend. It had been nearly a year since we had graduated, and we decided to head out to Greenville-Pickens Speedway for some entertainment and to catch up on what we've been up to in this time. As the races go by, we turn on the radio right before the late model main event, and, just like a year prior, Mark is leading the race late into the night. We stick around for the 50-lap feature, and past the halfway point, it looks like Randy Porter has this one pretty well in hand. So I turn to my buddy and tell him, Matt, it's been fun, but I gotta go home and watch this race. He, being a junior fan, knows what it's like to anxiously await your favorite driver's win after a long winless streak. So we say our goodbyes, pack up, and go our separate ways. I gun it home and thankfully don't get bought for speeding, and go to my room just in time to watch the final 5 laps, and he did it. Mission accomplished. It had been 4 years since his last winning season, and he finally got it done. In victory lane, Mark popped off like we had never seen before. For a few moments, a 50-year-old man was a kid again. He's fist pumping, jumping up and down, and high-fiving everybody. It was a popular win with everyone in attendance, and it seemed as though symbolically this was his last win. It gave me the same vibes as Terry Labonte winning the Southern 500 in 2003. And an old racing quote echoes through my head. You never know when you're going to win your last race, so celebrate every win like it's your last. I took that advice to heart, and I'm fist pumping right there with Mark Martin in the comfort of my own home on the other side of the country. And it took me a few hours until I could calm down enough to finally go to sleep. Any Mark Martin fan would have been completely satisfied with his 2009 season right there and then. All we wanted was one more trip to victory lane and we had gotten it. We wanted nothing else. It was the perfect send-off. But then Mark just starts riffing off wins. He won the Southern 500 again with win number 2 on the season, making this his first multi-win season in 10 years. Then at Michigan he was off the pace all day and Hendrick as a whole had struggled there. Hell, at the time Mercury had more wins at that track than Chevy. But with a savvy pit call by Alan Gustafsson, Mark stretches out the fuel and Jimmy Johnson runs out of gas coming to the white flag, and Greg Biffle takes the lead with Mark hot on his heels. But then on the backstretch, just 1 mile from victory, Biffle runs out of gas and Mark swings by underneath and brings it home for win number 3. His celebration here is even more fun than at Phoenix. He's jumping around and fist pumping all over the place. I remember watching this race from my living room and just completely losing it in front of my family. It was a completely unexpected win, as the last lap was the only lap Mark led all day, and it was nice to be on the side of good luck for once. Mark dominated at Chicagoland, and with a 4th place at Richmond in September, he just barely ekes his way into the chase. At the time, only the top 10 in points made it into the playoffs, and the points were completely reset, with 10 points being awarded for each win up to that point. So Mark goes from 10th in the standings to 1st. Hey, I'm not a fan of the playoffs in NASCAR, but if it meant that my guy had a better shot at winning a championship this year, then I was going to turn a blind eye to it to achieve my own ends. But surely this couldn't happen, right? A championship in a year where we only wanted to win just one race? It's absolutely unthinkable. But then, during the first race of the chase, Mark wins again at Loudon. The unbelievable is looking more and more likely. 2nd at Dover, 7th at Kansas, 4th at California, and then on to Charlotte, one of his best tracks. Me and my dad were able to attend that race thanks to a family friend who had tickets he couldn't use, and we'd even gotten a hotel room at the Embassy Suites just down the road. On our way to the track, just as fortune would have it, a crew member on David Reagan's team, the number 6 for Jack Roush, Mark's old ride, offers us a lift to the track. We're talking back and forth between the three of us, and the crew guy says, "Yep, I think this is Mark's year. I think he's gonna do it." My dad agrees and then asks what I think. I just take a deep breath and manage to say, "I've been here before." I guess I knew what was about to happen next. A 17th place finish that night wasn't as bad as it could have been, but a bad wreck at Talladega coming to the last lap and Jimmy Johnson narrowly avoiding the big one is enough to put the 48 out ahead for good. Going into the last race at Homestead, Mark is still mathematically eligible, but he needs a miracle that never comes up. Jimmy wins a record-setting 4th championship in a row. But hey, that's what you had to do in order to beat Mark for a championship. You had to go out and break records. You had to overcome massive points deficits. You had to win the most races on the season or the most races ever. And in the case of Jimmy, you had to win the most titles in a row. The 4 men Mark finished second to in the standings would go on to win a total of 21 championships and 301 races in the top division. Mark simply had the misfortune of being one of the greatest drivers of all time while he was competing against the greatest drivers of all time. Never before had one driver been so admired not only by fans but his competitors as well. Even the men he finished second to openly wished Mark had beaten them straight up. There was arguably never a driver more deserving of a title in NASCAR history than Mark. But in NASCAR, deserves got nothing to do with the outcome. But the 5th runner-up finish didn't seem to bother Mark. He congratulated his teammate and was all smiles. All he had wanted to do was win a race, and he had never expected to be here at season's end. This is all just icing on the cake. And you know what? I agreed. This was the least painful of all of his would-be championship seasons. Us Mark Martin fans had gotten all we wanted out of the season back at Phoenix. We could not have possibly asked for more, but we had gotten it anyway. However, Mark's success in 2009 has him reevaluate his career options. He's supposed to go part-time in 2010, but with so much success in 2009, surely he could win a few more races, right? He talks with Rick Hendrick and the boss man says to him, "Mark, we want you to drive this car as long as you will stay here." So he amends his contract to go full-time through 2011. And right off the bat, things look good. He sits on the pole for the 500 in February and finishes 12th. He follows it up with 2 top 5s, and then he just never could replicate his finishes from 2009. He got 7 top 5s on the year and just barely misses the playoffs. In 2011, Mark's thinking about dropping back to part-time again, but Rick is just too nice of a guy to let Mark beat himself up like that, and more or less convinces him to stay in the 5 car for the rest of 2011 as well. And despite 2 poles, his stats were worse than in 2010. In 2012, Mark steps away from Hendrick Motorsports and finally makes good on his plans to go part-time racing again. And he makes an odd choice on where to settle down: Michael Waltrip Racing. At that point, just a 2-win organization, MWR has brought in some serious talent with the likes of Clint Boyer and Martin Truex Jr. That year, both Truex and Boyer make it to the playoffs, and Boyer even manages to finish second in the point standings at the end of the year. And although Mark doesn't win, he sits on 4 poles, strings together a bunch of good runs, and at one point he had 2 races in the bag. One race at Michigan has him with the fastest car on the track, but as he was leading, a tangle between Bobby Labonte and Montoya sends him into pit road in an uncontrolled spin. He locks it up but hits an exposed pit wall in a horrifying crash, but thankfully the wall hit right behind the roll cage and seats itself in the rear end housing. Mark laughs it off in post-wreck interviews and walks away without a scratch. But a race in Pocono in the summer is the one that still irks him to this very day. Leading late in the race after a restart, Mark needs to only outrun Joey Logano. But Joey's contract is up at the end of the year, and he's desperate and most likely looking for a job at season's end. Mark had put the spotlight on Joey back when the young gun was just a teenager. He had alerted the media to the kid's talents and did a lot for him early on in his career. He even gave Joey his first nickname, Sliced Bread, because he's the best thing since. Mark's entire career got resurrected when an aging Bobby Allison tapped Mark to drive Roush's 6 car, and Mark said he'd rather slit his own throat than punt Bobby out of the way for a win. But Joey has no such loyalties and slips in behind Mark. Mark had never won at Pocono. He had 7 runner-up finishes and 20 top 5s there, but never a W. Please, just once, racing gods, I beseech thee. Please give us this one minor victory in the grand scheme of things. Just let Mark achieve this one last little thing. Nope, Joey boots him in the corner and gets the checkered flag. Had Mark won, he would have been the oldest winner in NASCAR history at 53 years, 5 months, and 1 day old. It would have been a great send-off, a fantastic final victory, but it just wasn't meant to be. And hell, this wasn't even the first time somebody in the 20 Home Depot car had done Mark dirty. Tony Stewart in 2000 at the All-Star race just flat out dumped Mark on the backstretch for no reason, and to this day I still don't like Tony and Joey specifically for these 2 events. Hey, if my driver can't win a cup after 20 years, then I'm allowed to hold on to decades-long grudges, okay? Mark may forgive, but I don't forget. For 2013, Mark's still with MWR. He finishes 3rd in the Daytona 500, nabs a pole at Phoenix, and the year is fairly ho-hum. But after Denny Hamlin is injured at a crash at California, Mark steps up to fill in for him at Martinsville. It wouldn't be the last time a team called upon his services to substitute an injured driver that year either. Tony Stewart had broken his leg in a sprint car crash, and Stuart Haas calls up the 54-year-old to drive what will eventually be his final few starts. After the final race at Homestead in November of that year, Mark quietly called it a career and turned the page on this part of his life for good. So what are we to make of all of this? What's the point? What's the moral of the story, if you will? Well, there really isn't one. Like so many other things in life, there isn't any narrative climax, no definitive conclusion, no triumphant resolution. It just kind of ends one day. Mark's career didn't end with a bang. It didn't end with some fantastic finish. He quietly brought it home mid-pack. Like so many that came before him, one day everybody cranked up their engines for a race, and you looked up at the ticker, only to not see him there anymore. At the end of the day, this story means whatever you choose to make of it. But I know that's not exactly satisfactory, so let me give you my take. There's a moment that I wasn't able to go into in this series that perfectly encapsulates the mindset of somebody like Mark Martin, and keeps me pressing forward no matter what happens, even to this day. In August of 1998, Mark's father, stepmother, and half-sister died in a plane crash in Nevada, and the week after, he asked to race at Bristol. He chokes back tears, dons his helmet, goes out there, and wins. He went out to that race that night because, well, what else was he supposed to do? When he had his entire career yanked out from underneath him and he was broke, he battled back into racing because what else was he supposed to do? Giving up is always an option, but ultimately it doesn't get you anywhere. When faced with the toughest circumstances, crack your knuckles, grit your teeth, and keep going. Because there really isn't any other practical option, and who knows what greatness awaits you at the end of your journey. You may not take home the ultimate prize, but at the end of the day, it's not the trophy that makes the man, it's the man that makes the trophy. Mark knew that. Hell, he knew it right from the beginning. That cup, that championship, as shiny as it might be, it means nothing if the men who hoist it up at season's end didn't have to climb up a mountain to get it. So, hold your head high, press forward, and try to crack a smile on the way up. Who knows where you'll end up, or who you'll inspire along the way. And to Mark Martin, if you ever happen to come across this series and you made it this far, I'd like to just say one thing. Many remember you as the greatest who never was, but to me, and so many others, you are the greatest who ever was. And we may never see your like, ever again.